Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the second form of learning called operant conditioning. In the first video, we looked at classical conditioning. If classical conditioning is learning through association, operant conditioning is learning through consequences. Classical conditioning is learning to respond to a new stimulus. In other words, no new response is learned. It's the same old behavior that's being elicited to the new stimulus. And this happens by associating the new stimulus, which is a neutral stimulus to start with the unconditioned stimulus, the food. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is learning to produce new responses that produce desirable consequences in the environment. Okay, the outcomes for this topic. First, we'll talk about the origins of operant conditioning. We'll talk about one prominent figure and his role in popularizing behaviorism through the principles of operant conditioning. Then we'll talk about the principles or characteristics of operant conditioning. And finally, we have a brief discussion on the applications of operant conditioning. Well, let's look at the origins of operant conditioning first. Well, the idea of operant conditioning comes from Thorndike's law of effect. Thorndike was an early learning theorist who is well known for an equipment like this. It's called the puzzle box. He was primarily interested in learning in animals, and typically in his experiments he would put a cat in a cage box and there would be food outside the cage. The cat would be inside the cage. The point here is that the cat has to learn to press this lever which opens the door in order to get to the food. What cat does, as you can imagine, is it can't use logic. So it tries several things until it accidentally presses this lever, leading to a satisfying effect of door being opened. Then the cat goes to the food. Imagine what happens when the cat is put inside the cage again. Well, it is more likely to press the lever to get to the food. So, based on these experiments, what Edward Thorndike did is he proposed the law of effect. Now, according to this law, the responses, for instance of pressing the lever in this case, with satisfying effects are learned and are more likely to be repeated. And the responses, like trying other things in this example, with unpleasant effects, meaning the door not opening, are weakened and they are less likely to be repeated. And operant conditioning and the principles of operant conditioning are actually based on these two important laws of effect. These two important principles of the law of effect proposed by Edward Thorndike. This increase in likelihood of the cat pressing the lever is called reinforcement. This reinforcement is a way to strengthen a particular behavior. At the same time, the cat learns not to press other things. This decrease in likelihood of other things that did not give a positive consequence of getting to the food is punishment. So punishment leads to weakening the behavior. Reinforcement leads to strengthening of behavior, and punishment leads to the weakening of a behavior. Well, this brings us to the second outcome for this topic, the role of B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. So the idea of operant conditioning and the principles of learning associated with it, especially under the behaviorist movement, was popularized by B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner specifically applied the principles of operant conditioning to human learning, more importantly in the context of education. B.F. Skinner was a scientist at the Harvard University, and he's the first one to describe this kind of learning in 1900s, especially in late 1930s. In fact, he was so popular that his theories of learnings and actually influenced the policymakers to an extent that at that time there were these teaching machines that were specifically created to actually teach kids to learn through reinforcement and punishment. Let's now look at the principles of operant conditioning that were proposed by B.F. Skinner under the banner of behaviorism. So with this objective or the outcome, we're going to talk about 4 different principles or characteristics of operant conditioning. First, we'll talk about reinforcement, then we'll talk about punishment. That'll get us to the discriminative stimulus, followed by shaping, and finally extinction. Let's talk about reinforcement first. Okay, so what you see here is an experimental apparatus, also known as operant chamber. This was devised by B.F. Skinner for testing laboratory animals in his operant conditioning experiments. It is commonly referred to as the Skinner box. A Skinner box is a small enclosure in which an animal can be reinforced, say with a food pellet, for making a particular response, such as pressing the lever. And the rate of response is systematically recorded. In this particular box, as you can see, the floor is electrified to investigate escape or avoidance learning. And we'll come back to this escape and avoidance learning later. So let's look at this example here. In this example, you have a response of telling a joke, and let's assume that the consequence of that response or behavior is that you got a rewarding experience where people laughed, then you're more likely to repeat that joke. So the Skinner's principle of reinforcement holds that organisms tend to repeat those responses that are followed by a favorable consequence. In other words, reinforcement. As I can see, the Skinner preferred the term reinforcement to Thorndike's satisfying effects because the term reinforcement did not carry any mentalistic notions that the animal found the effects satisfying or pleasurable. So we defined reinforcement as strengthening a behavior. And you can strengthen a behavior or reinforce in two different ways. And one of them is positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement occurs when a response is strengthened if it is followed by the presentation of a rewarding stimulus. In this example, the response of pressing the lever by this animal increases if it is followed by a positive rewarding stimulus, that is food. So just to reiterate again, there are two ways to reinforce a behavior. In other words, there are two ways to strengthen a behavior. One way, as we discussed in the previous slide, is through positive reinforcement. Another way is through negative reinforcement. In positive reinforcement, the behavior of pressing the lever is followed by a desirable consequence. In negative reinforcement, on the other hand, the behavior of pressing the lever is followed by removal of the aversive stimulus. The rat in this example, when it presses the lever, and that results in the consequence, which is removal of the aversive effect of this electric shock. Hence, the tendency to press the lever increases in rat. So the rat can learn to press the lever if that behavior of pressing the lever is either followed by an addition of a rewarding stimulus or by removal of a negative stimulus. In the first case, it's called positive reinforcement. In the second case, it's called negative reinforcement. Now, let me summarize quickly the two kinds of reinforcement. I want you to think of reinforcement as strengthening a behavior. And there are two ways you can reinforce a behavior, either by positive reinforcement or through negative reinforcement. And think of positive as adding something and negative as removing something. A positive reinforcement is when a behavior is reinforced or strengthened by adding a rewarding stimulus. A negative reinforcement is again strengthening of the behavior, but by removing an aversive stimulus. So another way to look at it is this rewarding stimulus, in this case of positive reinforcement, acts as a positive reinforcer. Right? There's a negative stimulus or the aversive stimulus here reinforces the behavior, removal of it, by acting as a negative reinforcer. Keep in mind, a reinforcer or reinforcement is about strengthening. You can do it either by adding or subtracting. If you add, it's positive reinforcement. If you subtract, it's negative reinforcement. Of course, you'll add only positive. When you only add rewarding things if you want to strengthen a behavior. And when you remove something, you only remove the aversive thing to strengthen a behavior. So there are two types of reinforcers: primary reinforcer and secondary reinforcer. Primary reinforcers satisfy our basic biological needs or drives. So we are born to appreciate these reinforcers like sleep, food, sex, air. Secondary reinforcers, on the other hand, are not inborn. We acquire the value of these reinforcers through learning, usually through associating the secondary reinforcer with the primary reinforcers. So let's talk about the second characteristic or principle of operant conditioning, namely punishment. Contrary to reinforcement, punishment is weakening of a behavior. One suggestion I give my students is to think of punishment not as the act of punishing, but as weakening a behavior itself. In that sense, there are two types of punishment: positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment is weakening a behavior by adding an aversive stimulus. Negative punishment, on the other hand, is weakening a behavior by removing a rewarding stimulus. Let's look at a few examples here. This example demonstrates positive punishment. As you can see, an unacceptable behavior here is weakened by spanking, that is, by adding a by adding an aversive stimulus. The second image here portrays negative punishment. Here, the behavior is weakened by taking away kids' toys, which is equivalent to removing a rewarding stimulus. Here we see a representation of positive and negative punishment. Keep in mind that the positive punishment involves the introduction or addition of an aversive stimulus, whereas the negative punishment involves the removal or subtraction of a rewarding stimulus. To summarize then, conditioning can serve two different purposes. It could be to strengthen a behavior or to weaken a behavior. The first case it's called reinforcement, and the second case it's called punishment. Similarly, the intended purpose of conditioning can be achieved in two different ways. either by adding a stimulus or by removing a stimulus. When you add a stimulus, it's called positive reinforcement or positive punishment. When you remove a stimulus, you call it negative reinforcement or negative punishment. Keep in mind, however, that what you add and what you remove are different for different purposes. In other words, you add a rewarding stimulus for reinforcement, but you add an aversive stimulus for punishment. Similarly, you will remove an aversive stimulus for reinforcement, but remove a rewarding stimulus for punishment. Let's talk about the next characteristic or principle of operant conditioning, namely discriminative stimulus. Imagine what happens if the rat is rewarded with food only when the light is on and the rat presses the lever. The light here is acting as a discriminative stimulus. When the light is on, and if the animal performs a desired response, the food dispenser will release a food pellet. What are some examples of discriminative stimuli in your own life? Let me share one with you. I have a 6-year-old. She knows how to get things from me. I love that face when she says, "Papa, please." But she only uses that trick when I'm in a good mood. So my mood acts as a discriminative stimulus. Let's look at the next principle of operant conditioning, shaping. You cannot teach a rat to learn a new behavior overnight. Operant conditioning is usually established through a gradual process called shaping, which involves the reinforcement of closer and closer approximations to a desired response. Shaping is especially necessary when an organism does not, on its own, exhibit the desired response. For example, when a rat is first placed in a Skinner box, it may not press the lever at all. In this case, the experimenter begins shaping lever pressing behavior by reinforcing the rat for successive steps towards a target response, such as when it moves closer to the lever. Well, this brings us to the last principle of operant conditioning, extinction. Extinction in operant conditioning is the process by which the association between response and reinforcer is broken. For instance, the association between the response of pressing the lever and dispersing food is broken. The most efficient means of unpairing the response and the reinforcer is to stop reinforcing the operant response. That is, to not present food when the bar is pressed. The graph here represents time on x-axis and rat's cumulative response of pressing the lever on the y-axis. As you can see, the response is initially flat, suggesting the animal hasn't learned the response yet. It represents the initial stage of shaping. Over time, however, the flat line becomes slanted, suggesting an increase in rate of pressing the lever response. The more the slanting of this line, the higher the response, which only increases over time. But as you can see here, the rate starts decreasing, which is represented here with a decrease in slant, and eventually becoming a flat line, indicating extinction. Now, since the responses are graphed cumulatively, the line actually never goes down, even after the response is extinguished. It's only flattened. Now, we have covered all the principles of operant conditioning. However, there are two additional things about reinforcement that I would like to talk about. The first aspect of reinforcement that we'll talk about is called scheduling. A schedule of reinforcement determines which occurrences of a specific response result in the presentation of a reinforcer. In other words, which responses of pressing the lever, in the rat's case, results in presentation of the food pellet. The simplest schedule of reinforcement is a continuous reinforcement. A continuous reinforcement occurs when every instance of the response is reinforced. In the case of the rat, every time the rat presses the lever, it is presented with the food pellet. The second type of a schedule of reinforcement is partial reinforcement. Partial reinforcement occurs when a designated response is reinforced only some of the time. For instance, the rat receives the food only some of the times, not every time it presses the lever. As discussed in the previous slide, there are two types of scheduling: continuous and partial. In this slide, we're going to talk about partial scheduling. Partial scheduling or partial reinforcement is of 4 different types, represented here in these 4 different cells. Before we talk about each of these scheduling types, let's get oriented to this table. This is a 2x2 matrix table, and you can think of like 2 variables here. One is scheduling criterion, the other one is scheduling type. And there are 2 types of scheduling criterion: ratio and interval. There are 2 types of scheduling type: fixed and variable. The result is a 2x2 table with 4 possible cells. And the 4 possibilities are FR, which is an example for a fixed ratio kind of scheduling; FI, which is an example of fixed interval kind of scheduling; VR, which is a variable ratio kind; and VI, which is a variable interval kind. As we discussed earlier, the partial reinforcement is only reinforcing some responses, say of pressing the lever. The question is, on what basis? The scheduling criterion can be based on either the number of responses or based on the time If it is based on the number of correct responses, that scheduling is called ratio. If it is based on the amount of time that's elapsed, then it's called interval. An example for a ratio scheduling would be reinforcing responses after 10 correct responses. An example for an interval scheduling would be reinforcing response after, say, 10 seconds of no reinforcement. Let's look at the scheduling type now. It can either be fixed or variable, irrespective of the criterion of scheduling. Fixed ratio scheduling would be reinforcing a response after a fixed number of correct responses. For example, in FR20, reinforcement occurs after every 20 correct responses. A fixed interval scheduling, on the other hand, would be reinforcing a response following an interval of a fixed amount of time. For example, in FI20, reinforcement occurs to a correct response after 20 seconds of no reinforcement. A second type of scheduling is the variable type. A variable ratio scheduling would be reinforcing a response after a varying number of correct responses. For example, in VR20, reinforcement occurs after a varying number of correct responses. Sometimes reinforcement occurs after a single correct response, or sometimes after 15 correct responses, sometimes after 30 correct responses. The number, however, averages to 20. That's why it is VR20. A variable interval scheduling, on the other hand, would be reinforcing a response following an interval of varying amount of time. For example, in VI20, reinforcement occurs to a correct response after varying intervals of no reinforcement. For instance, sometimes the reinforcement occurs after a response after 5 seconds of interval, sometimes after 10, sometimes after 35. The time, however, averages to 20 seconds, and that is why it is VI20. However, there are short pauses immediately after reinforcement. Also, this kind of scheduling has lower resistance to extinction. For example, a single non-reinforcement may facilitate extinction. What are some common examples of this kind of scheduling? A variable ratio schedule entails reinforcing a desired response following a variable number of non-reinforced responses. Variable ratio schedules like fixed ratio schedules, tend to produce a rapid response rate. However, variable ratio schedules, unlike the fixed ratio ones, have higher resistance to extinction. In other words, single or several non-reinforced instances would not lead to extinction of the response, given it's a variable ratio. Well, this is a slot machine. And what kind of schedule you think this is based on? Well, I'm going to pause you for a second and let you think. Well, it's based on the variable ratio scheduling, as the number of non-winning responses varies greatly before each time the machine pays out. And this kind of scheduling, there is higher resistance to extinction. That's why people don't give up and continue to play. Interval schedules require a time period to pass between the presentation of reinforcers, and a fixed interval schedule entails reinforcing the first response that occurs after a fixed time interval has elapsed. And you can see that there are long pauses between reinforcements, creating this pattern called scalloping effect. Also, fixed interval, similar to fixed ratio, or have lower resistance to extinction. One good example for the fixed interval scheduling is the Black Friday sale. Once a year, after Thanksgiving, the retail stores have large discounts in preparation for the Christmas on a day called Black Friday, and shopping before the sale does not provide the reinforcement. A variable interval schedule entails giving the reinforcer for the first response after a variable time interval has elapsed. In this kind of scheduling, you can see that there is a low study rate, unlike the fixed ones. However, there are no pauses in variable interval scheduling. Also, like the variable ratio scheduling, the variable interval scheduling too has higher resistance to extinction. One example of variable interval scheduling is the behavior of constantly checking a cell phone to see if there are text messages waiting, which is reinforced by the periodic receipt of text messages. Well, there is one more important aspect of reinforcement that we need to address. Here we'll talk about escape learning and avoidance learning. To demonstrate escape learning in the laboratory, the animal learns to perform an operant response to terminate an aversive stimulus. The animal is placed on a shuttle box with an electrified floor on one side and a non-electrified floor on the other side. A light and a shock are turned on at the same time. The animal learns to escape the aversive stimulus by running to the other non-electrified compartment. Keep in mind that the escape learning occurs after the fact. An example of escape learning is putting numbing cream on your skin after you have been badly sunburned. If escape learning is learning to escape an aversive stimulus, avoidance learning is learning to avoid an aversive stimulus. In a laboratory demonstration, avoidance behavior is conditioned by presenting a non-aversive stimulus, usually a light or bell, that signals that the aversive stimulus, for instance electric shock, will follow in a few seconds. So the animal learns to avoid the aversive stimulus by moving to the adjoining non-electrified compartment when the light appears, but before the pain or the painful stimulus is presented. So if you think of escape learning as learning to escape and which happens after the fact, avoidance learning is learning to avoid before the event, to avoid the aversive stimulus. An example of avoidance learning is putting sunscreen on before you go out into the sun to prevent getting a bad sunburn in the first place. Well, this brings us to the last outcome of this module, that is the applications of operant conditioning. Well, in the applicational part of this particular topic, I really want you to learn some additional information about punishment and about the positives, the pros, and the negatives, the cons of using punishment by parents. Please read the appropriate section from the book chapter. As with classical conditioning, there are several real-world applications of operant conditioning. Examples are biofeedback training, behavior modification, and programmed instruction. I want you to gather more information about these three from the textbook and try to connect these to operant conditioning and the principles of operant conditioning. This brings us to the end of module 5.2, operant conditioning, and we'll talk about module 5.3 in the next video about cognitive learning. Just to give you some basics, cognitive learning is learning by producing mental representations or mental maps. Classical conditioning was described as conditioning or learning via association, and operant conditioning as learning via consequences. Cognitive learning is learning by developing mental representations.